This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 445, entitled Masculism as Abolitionism. Description. This flyer illustrates the close historical analogy between negro slavery in the US in the 1800s and man-slavery today. The masculists are out to destroy man-slavery by destroying fluffies, wiping them out by refusing to have anything to do with them, forcing them to rot on the shelf so that their fluffy man-slaving parasite genes are removed from the gene pool. Women now have a career window of half a century, so must work. Those women who don't are manslavers and will be ignored to death by the masculists and later by society, as most people of both sexes are affected by masculist ideas. Now the flyer itself. Make it a bit bigger. Masculism as Abolitionism by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women, often for decades of a man's life. Over a century ago, such man-slavery would not have been seen as such, since it was merely a necessity. Men simply had to pay that price to get any sex from a woman, since in those days there was no effective contraception, or it was too expensive, so when a couple sexed, there was always the risk of a pregnancy. The industrial revolution necessitated the growth of the nuclear family due to its superior mobility compared to the traditional multi-generational family on the farm. When the factory system came in, and with it modern capitalism, machine-driven businesses often went out of business, so employees who had nothing other than their labour power to sell to the owners of the factories, the owners of the machines, were forced to move to another machine-driven business at another location in order to earn a living. Otherwise, in an era in which there were no unions, no unemployment insurance, no health insurance, no labour-based political parties, etc., those employees who did not have a job merely starved, and so did their families. Times were brutal in those days. But those days were also a time of increasingly science-based medicine and awareness of the presence of germs, bacteria, etc., so that the infant mortality rate dropped, so that when women had their dozen or so kids, most of them survived, so that it became necessary for women to stay at home. Looking after a dozen kids, definitely a full-time job, with all its clothes washing, lighting fires, cooking for a large family, cleaning the house, ironing, etc. Definitely a full-time job. So how did the nuclear family survive financially? Through the labour of the husband, the father, of course. Thus were born the traditional gender roles of the stay-at-home mother who had a dozen kids to look after, definitely not a shirker role, and of the breadwinning father who worked outside the house in machine-based businesses, for example, the cotton mill, manufacturing businesses, etc., to earn the money to support his family. These traditional gender roles have been with us for several generations. Since I'm in my 70s, I have lived long enough to be able to remember as a child the attitude of my middle-class father that, quote, "No wife of mine will work outside the home, since that would be a very negative reflection on my ability to earn enough to support my family." End quote. This was a very commonly accepted attitude at that time, over half a century ago, especially amongst The middle class. Women too expected men to be the breadwinners, since they were totally preoccupied with raising the children, with very busy days doing the myriad household chores that took up all the hours of the day. Over the decades, things changed. The most revolutionary of them was the male invention of the contraceptive pill in the 1960s that gave women effective control of the number of kids they wanted, which turned out to be 0, 1 or 2. Men also gave women household gadgets such as the washing machine, the dishwashing machine, the clothes dryer, the microwave cooker, etc., thus seriously reducing the number of hours needed to fulfill the housewife role of the mother. Thus, it is not surprising that upper middle class women with university educations in the Western countries got bored with their housewife role, with too many empty hours in the day. So they wanted to take up the traditional role of their husbands, that is, to be careerists, working outside the home for money, their own money, so that they were no longer financially dependent on a man. Thus, the second wave of the feminist movement was born in the late 1960s. Half a century later, most women work outside the home, living in a historical era in which the feminists have achieved a lot of power, especially in areas that are of real concern to women, for example, equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, etc., and especially in the divorce courts. The feminists took over the divorce courts, labelling them family courts, which privileged divorcing women so much that men now began to really suffer. The feminists of the 70s knew nothing about masculism, since it barely existed in those times, so not surprisingly, they brought with them their unconscious, unquestioned assumptions about the gender role of men as the family breadwinner. When a divorce occurred with children, these divorcing feminists wanted to keep their role as child raisers, so pushed for giving women almost sole custody of the children after a divorce, that is even today at a 90% rate of childed divorces. These feminists saw men as the breadwinners of the family and did not question it, since they had grown up with that role model for men all their lives. So for them, the only difference between a pre-divorced household and a post-divorced household was that the husband, that is the ex-husband, no longer lived in what was his house that he paid for. So, over the decades, since the legislation of fault-free divorce in the 70s, men have been increasingly financially and emotionally crucified in the feminist-controlled divorce courts. They lose custody of their kids with a 90% probability. They are forced to give up his house to his ex-wife. He is forced to make child payments to her for his kids, whom he will barely see. He is forced to give her half of his stuff, half of his wealth, and if his wife is economically unskilled, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with the ex-wife not being obliged to become financially independent, since she is merely continuing her traditional role of being a housewife, living off the money of her husband, now ex-husband. Thus we have here the major reason for the growth of the men's lib movement recently, the rise of the MGTOW, that's men going their own way. That is, men who refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves, due to the awful toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the feminists who still have traditional expectations of men's role as the family breadwinner. The recent rise of the masculists takes a much bolder step, radicalising the men's lib movement by telling women that they must become FIPs, financially independent persons. Since women now have a career window of over half a century, so masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, by bothering to get a career competent education, so that they can become FIPs as adults, and not expect fluffie style to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. Masculists see that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, so that the average upper middle class woman has a career window of half a century, as can be readily calculated. For example, imagine she gets her master's degree at the age of 23, then works for 5 years, marries, and has her first kid at age 29, and her second at 31. Once her second kid reaches the age of 4 and is off to kindergarten, she can get back to work full-time at the age of 35. She will live another half-century, so has a career window of half a century. This is the basic underlying reality that masculist demands on women are based on. Today's masculists are telling women, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work, since anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will eventually get you killed." The masculists see themselves as abolitionists, that is, anti-slavers, closely analogous to the abolitionists of the northern states of the US in the 1800s. The abolitionists saw the slavery of Negroes as a moral abomination and as a war issue. The US Civil War was largely over slavery. The masculists see today's fluffydom as manslavery and as a moral abomination. That too may end up as a war issue, a sex war, if women refuse to fip up and oppose the masculist push for the fipping of women, the creation of a fip society, where young girls are socialised by parents and educated by teachers and professors to be fips, or be severely punished by men by not getting one, thus forcing her to rot on the shelf, miserable for the rest of her life, because she is manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at by society for being a manslaving, fluffy parasite seen as vermin by society. Lately, I've been watching quite a number of YouTube videos on the historical role played in the US in the 1800s by William Lloyd Garrison. In brackets, I remember his name by adding son to my own family name. I see Garrison as the primary cause, the father of the US Civil War, since it was he who really established the anti-Negro slavery movement with the establishment of his anti-slavery abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831, 3 decades before the start of the US Civil War in 1861. I identify closely with Garrison since we have a lot in common. I see myself as the father of masculism, since it's my term, coined in the early 70s, when I was an avid male feminist, hoping that feminism would make women interesting. That is, so I could share my intellectual passions with women for pure math and math physics, but that never happened. I rebelled against the vapidity of my mother's housewife generation and hoped that female careerism, advocated so strongly by the feminists, would make women fully adult, taking responsibility for their own lives, and not expect to parasite off the money of a man, her man-slave husband. I've given masculism most of its concepts and their corresponding labels, hundreds of masculist terms, a veritable masculist jargon that are presented as glossaries in these masculist MGTOW flyer series of essays. When I talk to women about the close analogy between Negro slavery in the 1800s in the US and man-slavery today, most women don't accept the analogy, so I need to spell out the close analogy between the two forms of slavery. What is slavery? How is the concept defined? Slavery is forced working for someone else, receiving no wage in return. The masculists claim that that is what a fluffie does to her man-slave husband. He works for her and she does not pay him. He is manslaved in that sense. If the kids of the woman, the mother, are off to kindergarten or school, then, with her household gadgets, etc., she has plenty of time on her hands. This situation is still very much the case today in gender politically backward countries like Japan and Korea, where in Japan there's a saying, quote, "In Japan, the husbands overwork and the wives play tennis," end quote. It's not surprising that young generation of Japanese men are horrified at the lack of quality of life led by their salaryman fathers who worked 11 hours a day, commuted 3 hours a day, handed over their paychecks to their fluffy wives who gave him a meagre allowance and spent the rest on the kids, in brackets, whom the father orphans because he got home so late, close brackets, the apartment and herself, her clothes, her trips, etc. Young Japanese men, the herbivores, that's grass eaters, are rebelling in droves, refusing to marry and have kids, since they don't want the horrific lifestyle of their fathers, so wipe their hands of the traditional salaryman role. Thus, in the modern world, in many countries, millions of women are effectively living off the money and labour of a man, and she is not paying him. Therefore, by definition, she is manslaving him. She is exploiting him, taking his money without her working for it. She is a parasite, a fluffy, parasiting manslaver. This is the end of part 1.